All right, how's everyone doing? So, we're going to talk a little bit about how you might get parted from your Bitcoin, and it has to do with a particular form of attack that is a civil attack and a social engineering attack, and it is called fiat medicine. You will be departed from your Bitcoin if you enter this healthcare system that is currently centrally controlled. It is heavily politicized. It's one-size-fits-all medicine, and these markets are controlled with mandates, kickbacks, and all types of capture. However, this community is in a unique position to actually be able to address this, because the core of this problem is actually from something known as what we call fiat science in peer review. The peer review system is incredibly centralized, and gets induced into these mob attacks where they get all types of researchers to come and take down papers that are counter-narrative and accelerate papers that are in fact that are for the narrative. There's lots of conflicts in this centralized medicine. We have the NIH that has billions of dollars being handed out, yet they're on the royalty stream of the vaccines. So you can imagine how medicine can end up in disrupting your actual health in your time chain. If you don't believe me, there's many different examples of this during the pandemic. James Todaro, a great Bitcoiner, actually weeded this one out called Surgisphere. Surgisphere was a fraud that ended up taking HCQ off the market, that stopped the clinical trial, people died, and nobody went to jail. The Watson paper came out, a complete and utter fraud. This paper suggested that these vaccines saved millions of people. It's now known that this is actually a modeling error. There's the Proximal Origins paper that tried to claim that this virus came from a pangolin that mated with a bat. This is another egregious fraud that has set the narrative that this gain-of-function research actually does something productive for us, in fact, when it creates leaks. And of course, there are all the other SSRIs, the statins, Vioxx, Fosamax. These are all drugs that have proven to do the opposite of what they've been claimed to do. Fosamax being perhaps the most potent one, which was meant to help osteoporosis and gave you brittle bones. And so there's a flatten the curve story, but what I want to focus on today is the one that hit the most people, which are the mRNA vaccines. These things were distributed to 5 billion people, 13 billion doses, and this was very much BitConnect in the biotech space, all right? We basically had the FDA running cheerleaders for these vaccines when they're supposed to be the regulator. So to understand where this went wrong, you have to know a little bit about the proof of work that goes on in DNA. In order to write DNA, you have to consume cellular energy. You've got to consume ATP. It gets literally written into the message. So this proof of work system is what's required for this DNA chain, if you will, to get distributed around the world and for it to have high fidelity. Jack Mallers gave us a great talk. A couple conferences ago, he talked about DNA being a time chain, or at least the Bitcoin system being a time chain that's required to synchronize global transactions. Your DNA is a very similar time chain in that it is globally replicating, and it replicates at a faster rate than the 10 to the 21st hash rate that you have in Bitcoin. Every day, about 1% of your cells divide. That contributes enough DNA that ends up being about 10 to the 16th number of bases that get replicated per second per day. There's about 7 billion nodes around the world replicating this much DNA. And if you add in all of the RNA component to this ends up being an energy unit that gets consumed at around 7 times 10 to the 28th bases per day that are getting replicated to propagate the human genome throughout the globe. Now, these are very large numbers. Put them into context. Your DNA blockchain, every day, just the 1% of the cells of your DNA that gets replicated stretches from here to the sun 4 times, if you were to line it up end by end. That's very hard to conceptualize. But it should give you a little bit of humility before you go and start monkeying with it with these vaccines that can actually alter your DNA. And that's what I'm going to show you, is that the vaccines had a DNA contamination in them they didn't tell you about that could, in fact, alter your genome. All right, these people are vibe coding your genome. And this is a major attack surface to the human gene pool, because if this thing starts to alter the lifespan of people, it's going to part you with your Bitcoin. You're going to end up spending money in a fiat system that has no controls, has no liability, and ends up oftentimes inducing mandates to get what it wants done. Many people have gone and replicated this work. It happened on Twitter. It did not happen very quickly in the peer review system. The peer review system kind of kicked it out. Some of these papers have now been peer reviewed, but it took years for them to come to this conclusion. Now, the FDA, the EMA, and the TGA have all admitted that this mistake has happened. How did it happen? There was a big bait and switch. Pfizer actually ran the trial of 22,000 people on the process on the left, and after they got through the trial, they then switched to the process on the right and didn't retrial the drug. And in doing so, they left a tremendous amount of excess DNA behind in the product. So all of the vaccine efficiency numbers you've heard in the news are flawed, they're not real, because that's not what actually went into the trial. What went to the public was actually something that came out of this process too. It's published now in the BMJ that this fraud happened, and no one has yet been prosecuted for it. So what did they leave in there? What they left in there was something we know from the polio scandal. If you're not familiar with the polio scandal, the polio vaccines were also contaminated with something known as SV40, and it created a massive cancer wave. Now, the whole virus isn't in these vaccines, but there is a very curious part of this called the SV40 region that Pfizer intentionally removed from the disclosure that they gave to the FDA. So the FDA has admitted that this SV40 material is in there. They did not spell this out to the regulators did not find them, and they're actually running cover for them saying this DNA is of too little consequence to matter, it's too small, and it's not functional. But we know it's functional because Dean et al. Has published that this piece of DNA drives DNA straight to the nucleus. It gets used in gene therapy vectors. Drayman, skipped over that one. Drayman actually shows the piece of DNA binds to P53. P53 is your tumor suppressor gene. You have to think of this as the piece of the enzyme that makes sure that your Bitcoin transactions meet a certain fidelity. Without this, your cells go awry and you end up with cancer. There's also SV40 papers suggesting that these are hypermutability elements and drive carcinogenesis. And we also have papers from Strayer et al. That demonstrate this is the DNA that's required to integrate DNA into your DNA. Liminal shows that this happens at a much higher rate when you start bringing lipid nanoparticles into the picture. Lipid nanoparticles are unique to these vaccines. So the FDA does have guidelines that you can only have so much DNA in a particular vaccine, but those guidelines never considered wrapping these things in lipid nanoparticles, which protect that material. That's the whole reason why the mRNA vaccines are supposed to work and that they don't get destroyed in a few minutes, is they're protected by these fat bubbles. Well, when those fat bubbles are around, they push this DNA into the nucleus even faster. And you don't have to read the papers, you can just read Moderna's patents that actually admit to this, that this DNA is a risk. Okay, so what has this turned into? There are a host of papers that demonstrate this material is sticking around longer than the 48 hours that they promised. There's the Krausen paper showing it in heart tissue. It ends up being there for 30 days. It ends up in lymph nodes for 60 days. They find it in placentas for 2 to 10 days. They find it in plasma for 28 days and breast milk for 5 days. None of this was disclosed in the informed consent process. And now we have people looking for the protein, and they're finding the spike protein after vaccination being in some of the injured people 709 days out in one study and 245 days in the other. Now, we've gone and looked at this in many other studies. I know we're a little bit shorter on time. I'm just going to skip through these so the cameras get the receipts for you guys, but there's multiple studies where we're now finding this in the blood. There's the Ryan study, the ODAC study, the Nabel study, and the Lee study, and the Krasik study. So the DNA is now contaminating the blood supply. So the blood supply has some of this vaccinated SV40 material in it, and we don't know what the consequences of that are, and you're not going to hear about it in the news, and it's very hard for you to actually hear this in the peer review system, which is why we need to fix it, and Bitcoin can help us do that. So what's going to come with this cancer? How bad is it? Well, the DNA alone probably won't cause the cancer, but the vaccines have other components in there that are probably contributing to this. They lower your T cell counts, and they have a spike protein that is known to inhibit P53 as well. So they do satisfy this multiple hit concern, and even the DNA, if it doesn't integrate to your genome, can be a risk. This is what's going on currently in social media, is that most people needed zero evidence. If they got a free donut, they took the shot, and now they want 10 peer-reviewed papers to tell them what is the obvious thing that's happening. I would encourage you to follow John Bodwin. He's been getting death records from all the states, and he can see a cancer wave. You can see the cancer wave in the CDC's own data as well. David Wiseman has published on that. And if you follow Edward Dow and the Ethical Skeptic, you'll see that the drug sales for the cancer drugs are going through the roof. So we have multiple angles of data suggesting this cancer wave is already here, and that it's coincident with the vaccines. And no one likes coincidences, but there are cases where there are tumors in 5 days after injection right at the site of injection, and we have some of the rarest forms of cancer being found. These are cancers of the heart. The heart usually doesn't get cancer. These are sarcomas that also showed up during the polio epidemic. So the regulators they've been FOIA'd by all of these wonderful journalists here. And what they found in those FOIAs is that they're telling the public one thing and they're seeing something else. They're telling Pfizer to remove this stuff and they're telling the public that it's of no consequence. So beware. So let's look at Japan. Japan's the most vaccinated country in the world, and they now have an excess mortality of about 500,000 deaths, and it is larger than the tsunami in Hiroshima combined. This has been an absolute disaster for the demographics. They're also seeing for the first time that their time chain is eroding. You can see here, right there, after the vaccination program, the first time in decades, they have a lower expected life expectancy. That's how your Bitcoin is going to get drained, right there. Because in that process, you'll be in an idiosyncratic healthcare system that won't know how to treat you, and it will be scan after scan. And Pfizer knows something about this, because they've already gone out and bought and spent billions on cancer companies. So the way to fix this with Bitcoin, we did this in 2018. We crypto funded the sequencing of the cannabis genome, because this is a plant that has many compounds that cure cancer. And it is a plant that's fairly decentralized. Anyone can grow it in their backyard. There's hundreds of cannabinoids that it makes, and it's a very productive method. So what we did in this process is we did a crypto-funded peer-to-peer review, no centralized journal. We basically just published this on-chain, hashed the data on-chain, recruited people with crypto to peer review it. Everything was done in 7 days. Typically, peer review can take 7 months. This is incredibly important to speed up the rate of science. If we are moving at a metronome of 7 months for peer review and for people to replicate work, it radically changes and exponentially alters the space of how fastly we move out of poverty and how we perform science if we can do that in 7 days. So we need to do this on-chain. We've been doing this on-chain. We've got thousands of cannabis genomes that we have sequenced, hashed them, put them on Bitcoin. We've been doing this for almost a decade now, and it's gone to court and actually has settled people's IP and who owns which genetics. We're doing this with other medicinal organisms. We're doing this with Psilocybe cubensis because it makes very important low toxicity tryptamines, like psilocybin. And we have a company that basically makes picks and shovels for these industries so that they can perform genetic acceleration on these organisms. Okay, so science is a time chain, and we need to be able to know when science occurred. When I read a paper in the 1980s, I know they didn't have PCR, which means there are limitations to what they're telling me. If I read one in the 90s, they didn't have sequencing. That means there's limitations to what they're telling me. All science is built on prior science, and so we need a time chain and a system of recording when things happened in an immutable way so they can't be attacked by mobs and civil attacks. There's a couple different ways to make this happen, but I do think this is within the vision of Satoshi. The first message he gave us had a why. Why was he doing this? What we need in Bitcoin to make this happen is a little bit more use of the op return. I know that's a hot debate right now, is how we use the op return. But the op return, we've been putting these hashes in there currently. I think the only additional thing we need to make this peer review sing is to put a link to IPFS, Nostr, or some other data store so we do not bloat chain with scientific data. We just put the timestamp in there and where to find the results so that this thing can be decentralized and we can have science that's free of journals that are trying to steer who should be locked down, who should wear masks, why you should take liability-free jabs. So I'd also encourage people, if you like what we're doing here, to think about funding science in a decentralized way. Anthony Fauci isn't going to come help the vax injured. They're not going to come help you after the mess that they just created. What we're doing is sequencing many of the vaccine injured. And if you want to contribute, there's a Bitcoin address on that slide that is going to go toward helping understand what's going on with these vaccines. Thank you for your time.
Secure your BTC Prague 2026 ticket at the lowest possible price now.